Okay.
But for those who may not be familiar, can you describe McCarthy's upbringing in Knoxville and the role it's played in his career as an author?
Yes, well, he was born in Rhode Island, but grew up here from preschool years. His father was a TVA lawyer, and they were a large Catholic family. He grew up being familiar with downtown Knoxville. They were connected with Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, which is very close to where I'm sitting right now. But they ended up settling in South Knox County, kind of near the city limits line down there off Martin Mill Pike. And Knoxville was very much part of his growing up, and it was the subject of his first stories and novels. So they were a lot of his, especially The Orchard Keeper, his very first novel was set in heavily set in the South Knox County area with some scenes in downtown Knoxville. His later book, Suttree, was very, very richly and specifically set in Knoxville proper. It came out in 1979, and that was one of his first, his last. I think that was his last book before he started writing the westerns that he became more famous for. He wrote four novels while he lived here, and I've learned in recent years that he actually came back to Knoxville and was working on Blood Meridian when he was living in the Bearden area and in the early 1980s. Actually, living by himself in a motel room there.
Okay, and that kind of brings me, that's kind of the hook as to why we're talking to you, is Blood Meridian is actually potentially being looked at to be made into a movie. So my next question is, why do you think Blood Meridian is considered McCarthy's greatest work and one of the most important American novels?
Yeah, well, I guess that's what some people have said. It's his greatest work. I prefer some of his other books better, but it has a fierce power to it, just a very elemental power in terms that it has a lot of action in it and a lot of extremely violent action in it, and that's of course what makes a lot of movies these days. But it's one of the most vivid books certainly of all, and it's both attractive to filmmakers who usually don't flinch from gore, but the book has a whole lot of gore in it. It's a very, very violent book, and a lot of several filmmakers have looked at it and considered it as a movie, but none have actually succeeded with it, and I don't. Some people have considered it unfilmable, maybe because of its violence. But anyway, it's got a lot of great prose in there as well. McCarthy is brilliant with putting words together and kind of showing people in ways that are both horrifying and funny in a way that you recognize human traits in these extreme situations, that even though you might not be in these extreme situations, you recognize people like this, the tendencies people have to to brag or to be ashamed or whatever that you see in the characters of McCarthy.
All right, and one thing you just said kind of struck me because I think you might be right in this. Like 1995, 1990, 1985, you didn't see a whole lot of gore, but nowadays the movie sphere, so to speak, has changed a little bit. Do you think it's more apt to get made today?
That's a good question. I think there were some gory movies in the 80s. I remember, I think Halloween was one of the first really, really fiercely gory movies I ever saw. And I believe that was in the late 70s. But it may be that there are, and I think it's partly McCarthy's place in American culture is much greater than it was in the 1980s, when only people who really knew a lot about literature and knew about McCarthy in the early days. He got good reviews in New York Times and the literary journals throughout his career, but he was not really well known until after All Pretty Horses, and later even more so No Country for Old Men, were major motion pictures, and he became kind of extremely popular in a way that he had never been before. So that may be one of the impeti about trying to make a movie now, because I think he's still alive, and people are still interested in his work, and have become more interested in the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, because I've seen No Country for Old Men, and that the movie itself was fantastic.
Yeah.
So the next question would be, the American West has been portrayed in books and on screen countless times. What makes Blood Meridian specifically different from all the others?
McCarthy goes in deeply into the psyche of his characters, and presents these people as not just as heroes and villains, but as sometimes a weird combination of the two, or and it brings out kind of a lot of realism and human psychology that you don't see in typical westerns. These are kind of just gripping psychological stories, and even though we don't really understand the psychology of some of these monstrous people, they present interesting figures. There's no character like Judge Holden in any Western up until now, with it, assuming they make Blood Meridian. He's an extremely refined, educated guy who's also a horrific sadist. These are they're much more complex characters, I guess, is the short answer to that.
All right, and so I'm going to have three more questions, mostly based on Knoxville and East Tennessee. But his novel, I can't even read right now. His novel, Suttree, is partially based on his own experiences in Knoxville. How would you describe the Knoxville McCarthy grew up in?
It was he knew the Knoxville of his time, which was he knew the highs and lows of it. You know, he grew up in an affluent family. His dad was a TVA lawyer, but at the same time, he seems to have known the underworld pretty well. He knew McAnally Flats and the riverfront, and he knew something about the people who lived under the bridges, and the people who went to the old Huddle bar downtown, and places like that. And he seems to have known these people, characters, about the time he was a UT student. I think he and his friends just kind of roamed around town a good deal, probably on foot, just getting to know these folks, the high and the low. And I hear Suttree's more about the kind of the low, I guess, the home, what we would call homeless now, or in the prostitutes and so forth, that he that did populate Knoxville, even though kind of a lot of people who lived here either didn't know about them or ignored them. McCarthy really dug into them and described their lives. The Knoxville of his youth was a more complex up and down Knoxville, although we still have lots of homeless, and they're very visible today. There were, hundreds and hundreds of people living along the river banks and in shacks. They weren't homeless exactly, but they were living in, there were squatters living in shacks or boxes or cliff dwellings or caves in various places. That's a Knoxville that's partly been erased. But meanwhile, the other Knoxville was up here on the top, and you had working poor and you had affluent people, and I think there was more of a mixture of people that you saw every day in Knoxville of 1950-51, which is when Suttree is set. Because today downtown Knoxville is mainly it's a mixture of people who are buying nice meals at good restaurants, and the homeless who are begging for money on the streets, and not a lot of in between. But you saw a lot of in between back then.
All right, and so McCarthy has lived in a few places around Knoxville, as well as in Louisville and Sevier County. Do you know if any of these homes are still standing, and have there been any preservation efforts?
Well, yeah, that's an irony right there because his book that won the Pulitzer Prize is called The Road, which also became a motion picture by the same director who's working on Blood Meridian now. But in The Road, it's interesting. The whole world is dead. Knoxville is depicted as being wiped out. There's almost nothing left of Knoxville, but his house is still standing. And the father shows his son walks across the river and walks down the road to where his house is, and describes the house that McCarthy grew up in off of Martinville Pike. And ironically, just after the book came out, within a year or so, that house burned down. And so it's funny that we still have Knoxville. Knoxville's in much better shape now than it was as he depicted in The Road, but his house was still there in the book, and is now and now is not there anymore. So there are a couple of houses in Sequoia Hills, interestingly, where he lived for a few months at a time in his early preschool years that are still standing. But whether they're worth saving just because of their association with McCarthy or not, I can't say. I don't think the motel in Bearden where he lived while he was working on Blood Meridian is still, I don't think it's still standing. It was near Homburg Place. Um, but uh, but yeah, that there aren't, as is the case with a lot of writers. It's funny how many writers, even living writers, like Nikki Giovanni, they're a lot of their neighborhood. In some cases, they have places that they're associated with. They're still standing, but their actual houses are gone now, and that's the case with almost all the famous writers who ever lived in Knoxville.
All right. And speaking of famous writers, authors do not always get recognized for their work during their lifetime. Why do you think McCarthy has become such a lauded literary figure later in his life?
And that's interesting. If he had died at age 50, he would never have been a you know household word anyway. I can't remember whether any bestsellers by that time, but he was not. He didn't try to be famous. He did not. He's an extraordinary writer that he's never given hardly ever given a book signing. Rarely ever has never given a speech that I know of. Doesn't do tours, doesn't do interviews, which is something that anybody that's written a book, even a small local book, gets used to the idea that you go around talking about it and trying to promote it. He just doesn't do that, and he didn't care about that. And I think that's something that I respect about him. He lived as if he were poor for much of his life, just because he didn't want to do the promotional stuff to sell his books. His books were respected by certain academics and people who love great literature, but they weren't bestsellers until he was in middle age, and he began to win big awards and have movies made from his books. So that's interesting and unusual. And there are a few other writers like Herman Melville, for example, who wrote Moby Dick, was not really all that famous during his lifetime. He was recognized more in retrospect. So it's a different rhythm. There's some writers who are very famous in their 20s and then get forgotten. It seems like there's a different pattern for every writer in terms of fame and recognition. But Cormac McCarthy is just a fascinating figure on lots of levels. He has been compared to William Faulkner. He has described Knoxville in extremely vivid detail, not often flattering detail, but Suttree makes Knoxville seem really fascinating, and kind of the way James Joyce made Dublin seem fascinating without ever saying a nice thing about it. And for people who love good writing, it's an interesting way to approach kind of promoting a city by, we have a Suttree Landing Park, which is something that might be surprising. You wouldn't read the novel Suttree and think this is great for the Chamber of Commerce, but it does make the place seem really, really interesting. And I think McCarthy adds multiple levels of description and meaning to the human experience that not all writers do, and that we often don't think about when we try to oversimplify our cities and our politics and everything else. But McCarthy, I think, is is there to remind us that this life is complicated, that life is horrifying sometimes, and this is real, or could be real, and these people are human beings, whether they're evil or not, and we recognize parts of ourselves in all of them.
All right, Jack, that sounds great.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, good luck with it.
All right. Thank you very much. You have a good day.
Sure, you too.
All right. Bye.